"Excuse me, sir. I'll have the crystal cleared away in a moment." Sarah Stone knelt on the manicured grass, her fingers trembling as they touched the jagged edges of a shattered flute. She was 24, dressed in a stiff black and white uniform that felt like a target, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. The groom stopped mid-pose, his hand freezing just inches from his bride's waist. Daniel Cross looked down at Sarah, his face reddening with a fury that felt far too large for a spilled drink. He burst out laughing, a sharp, jagged sound that silenced the string quartet and the soft chatter of the elite guests. "Cleared away." His voice boomed across the estate gardens, bouncing off the white silk canopies. "This is the Cross Vanderbilt Union, not a soup kitchen for the clumsy." He stepped forward, the scent of expensive bourbon and arrogance clashing with the expensive floral arrangements. He looked at her dark skin, then at the champagne soaking into her apron, shaking his head with theatrical disgust. "Look at those shoes. Look at the dirt you're bringing onto this lawn." Another charity hire looking for a pity tip. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a hiss that only Sarah and the nearby photographer could hear. "You're a stain on the background. You're poisoning my photos just by standing there. Get out before I have security throw you out like the trash you are. We have real people to celebrate here." The photographer didn't stop. He lowered his lens slightly, capturing the raw terror in Sarah's eyes and the venom on Daniel's lips. Behind them, the bride stood in a cloud of white lace, her hands clutching her bouquet so tight her knuckles were white, but she stayed silent. A wealthy guest from the front row snickered, loud enough to be heard. "Throw her out already. She's ruining the aesthetic." Laughter rippled through the wedding party. Cruel, elitist, and united against a woman who was just trying to do her job. No one defended her. Not the wedding planner, not the guests, and certainly not the woman in white. But none of them noticed the man in the pinstripe suit standing under the deep shade of a willow tree. Han Seo-jin adjusted his sunglasses, his expression unreadable, though the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. Within the hour, Daniel Cross would be begging, not for a perfect photo, but for his very life. Sarah Stone didn't run. She didn't scream. She gathered the glass, standing her ground with a quiet grace that Daniel couldn't comprehend. "Sir, I am doing my job," she whispered, her voice trembling but refusing to break. Daniel rolled his eyes, turning back to the camera. "Your job is to be invisible. Instead, you're a disaster." He had no idea that he had just insulted the only woman the most dangerous man in the city had spent years trying to protect. Daniel thought he was shouting at a maid with no one. He was actually signing a contract for his own destruction. The morning air at the Cross estate was brittle and cold, smelling of freshly clipped boxwood and the expensive, damp earth of a manicured landscape. In the cramped, dimly lit staff quarters tucked far behind the grand limestone mansion, Sarah Stone stood before a small, cracked mirror. The glass was old, distorting her reflection, but it didn't matter. She wasn't looking at her face. She was checking the precision of her uniform. She smoothed the crisp white apron over her black dress, ensuring the pleats were sharp enough to cut. Her fingers, calloused from weeks of double shifts and heavy trays, worked the small buttons at her throat with practiced efficiency. This was her armor. The black and white fabric wasn't just a dress. It was a cloak of invisibility. In this world of old money and towering egos, Sarah had learned that the less people saw of the woman, the safer the worker remained. "Just 8 hours," she whispered to her reflection, her breath hitching slightly. "Stay small. Stay silent. Don't let them see you." She checked her shoes, the same reliable flats she'd worn for 3 different catering gigs this month. They were polished to a dull shine, but the soles were thinning. She could feel every pebble in the gravel path as she walked toward the main house, a physical reminder of the gap between her world and the one she was about to enter. Inside the industrial kitchen, the air was a chaotic symphony of clattering silver, the hiss of industrial steamers, and the sharp, barked orders of the head butler. Sarah moved through the noise like a ghost. She didn't engage in the morning gossip with the other servers or complain about the early start. She simply picked up her assignment sheet. Section A, the Rose Garden, beverage service. The Rose Garden was where the most intimate photos would be taken. It was where the elites, the pillars of the Cross and Vanderbilt families, would gather to document their perfection. It was the highest pressure zone on the property. As she stepped out of the kitchen and toward the garden, the transition was jarring. The scent of grease and sweat was replaced by the cloyingly sweet aroma of thousands of imported white roses. The lawn looked like a sheet of emerald velvet, undisturbed and pristine. In the distance, she could see the marquee tents being raised, their white canvas flapping like the wings of giant, trapped birds. Sarah felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the weight of 1,000 unspoken rules. Rule 1. Never make eye contact with a guest unless spoken to. Rule 2. Always anticipate a need before it's articulated. Rule 3. Most importantly, never remind them that you are a person with a life, a history, or a soul. To them, she was a mobile fixture, a shadow that delivered champagne. She watched as the first of the guests began to trickle onto the lawn. Men in tailored suits that cost more than her yearly rent. Women draped in silks that shimmered like oil on water. They moved with a casual, effortless power that Sarah found more intimidating than any direct threat. They didn't even look at the staff as they passed. They walked through them as if they were nothing more than the wind. Sarah preferred it that way. Invisibility was her sanctuary. She had a life outside of these gates. A quiet apartment, a stack of books she was slowly working through, and a past she had worked incredibly hard to bury. Every shift was a performance, a high-wire act of staying beneath the notice of people who looked for reasons to be offended. She took her place near the marble fountain, her tray balanced perfectly on her fingertips. She adjusted her posture, shoulders back, gaze directed exactly 3 inches above the horizon line. She was the invisible girl, a silent witness to a world that would never acknowledge her presence. Today is just about survival, she reminded herself, watching a hawk circle high above the estate. Just a few hours of being a shadow. Then I can go home. She didn't notice the sleek black sedan pulling up the private drive, or the man in the pinstripe suit who stepped out, his eyes shielded by dark glasses. She didn't see him scan the crowd, his gaze lingering on the staff near the fountain for a second longer than a guest ever would. Sarah kept her eyes forward, unaware that the quiet life she had carefully constructed was about to be shattered by the very people she was trying so hard to avoid. The elites were arriving, and for Sarah Stone, the shadows were no longer a place to hide. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the rose garden, casting a deceptive golden glow over the assembled guests. Sarah Stone moved through the crowd with the mechanical grace she had practiced for years, her tray balanced perfectly as she navigated the narrow paths between the ornate floral arrangements. Every step was calculated, every breath was controlled. She was a shadow in a world of blinding light, and as long as she stayed that way, she was safe. The photographer, a frantic man in a sweat-stained suit, barked instructions at the wedding party. Daniel Cross and his bride stood beneath a canopy of cascading wisteria, the perfect image of dynastic union. Daniel adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed with a sense of ownership that extended to every blade of grass on the estate. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the quiet hum of high-stakes socializing. "More champagne," Daniel called out, his voice cutting through the soft music with a sharp, commanding edge. "And someone move that lighting rig. It's washing out the contrast on my tuxedo." Sarah approached, her gaze lowered to the height of his silver cufflinks. She moved to offer the tray, but as she stepped forward, the heel of her thinning shoe caught on a hidden root beneath the emerald turf. It was a momentary lapse, a fraction of a second where the physical world asserted itself over her careful composure. The tray tilted, A single crystal flute, filled to the brim with vintage champagne, slid across the silver surface and shattered against the stone base of a nearby pedestal. The sound of the breaking glass was like a gunshot in the silent garden. A fine mist of alcohol sprayed across the hem of Daniel's trousers and the toe of his hand-burnished Italian leather shoes. For a heartbeat, the garden was deathly still. Then the explosion came. "You clumsy, incompetent fool!" Daniel's voice didn't just rise. It vibrated with a visceral, jagged hatred. He spun around, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. He didn't see a worker who had made a mistake. He saw a blemish on his perfect day. Sarah dropped to her knees immediately, her fingers moving to gather the shards. "I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I'll have it cleared." Accident. Daniel stepped into her space, his shadow looming over her like a shroud. He pointed an aggressive finger at the dark stains on his pants. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs? Do you have any idea how much I paid for this photo session? You've ruined the shot. You've poisoned the entire aesthetic of this ceremony with your presence." He looked around at the guests, his eyes searching for an audience to validate his cruelty. "Look at this," he shouted, gesturing to Sarah as she huddled on the ground. "This is what happens when you try to be inclusive. You hire people who don't belong in these spaces, and they inevitably bring their mess with them. Look at her. She's a smudge on the background of my life." Laughter, thin and brittle, began to ripple through the crowd. It started with a few of Daniel's business associates in the front row and spread like a contagion. To them, Sarah wasn't a woman. She was a prop in a comedic interlude. The bride, draped in lace that cost more than Sarah would earn in a decade, looked away, her hands tightening around her bouquet but her lips remaining sealed. "I said get up," Daniel barked, his voice cracking with the force of his temper. He reached down and gripped Sarah's arm, hauling her to her feet with a roughness that made her wince. "Don't just sit there leaking tears. Look at the camera. I want the photographer to capture exactly what ruined my wedding photos. I want the agency to see the face of the girl who's getting sued for every cent she's worth." The photographer, sensing the shift in the entertainment value of the afternoon, didn't lower his camera. Instead, he stepped closer, the lens zooming in on Sarah's tear-streaked face and the champagne-stained uniform. Click, click, click. The flashes were blinding, stripping away the last of her dignity for the sake of the groom's tantrum. "Please, sir," Sarah whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "I'll leave. I'll go." "You'll go when I tell you to go," Daniel sneered, leaning in so close that his hot, alcohol-tinged breath brushed her ear. "Right now, you're going to stay right here and serve as a reminder of what happens when trash tries to play in the palace." In the back of the garden, standing beneath the deep, cool shade of an ancient willow, Han Seo-jin didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his pinstripe suit dark against the greenery, his sunglasses shielding eyes that were as cold as a winter sea. He watched the way Daniel's hand gripped Sarah's arm too tight. He watched the way the photographer feasted on her humiliation. He watched the way the elites laughed at a woman who had nowhere to turn. The air around Han seemed to thicken, a localized storm of silent, lethal intent. Daniel Cross thought he was the most powerful man in the garden because he held a microphone and a pedigree. He didn't know that the man in the shadows was currently calculating the exact value of everything Daniel owned, and how quickly he could turn it all to ash. The public humiliation continued, the groom's shouts echoing off the limestone walls of the mansion, but the balance of power had already shifted. Daniel had his photos, but he had no idea that he had just documented the moment his own empire began to fall. Sarah Stone stood in the center of the storm, her head bowed, unaware that the silent observer in the sunglasses was no longer just watching. He was waiting. The lens of the professional camera was a cold, glass eye, staring at Sarah with a mechanical indifference that felt more intrusive than a physical blow. Daniel Cross hadn't let go of her arm. His grip remained a bruising vice, pinning her in place as if she were a captured specimen. He gestured wildly with his free hand, summoning the photographer, a man whose hands were visibly shaking as he adjusted the settings on his high-end DSLR. "Get closer, Miller," Daniel barked, his voice laced with a cruel, jagged excitement. "Don't just stand there. I want every detail. I want the smudge on her collar, the way she's shaking, and the exact position of the glass she broke. This isn't just a wedding album anymore. It's an evidence file. I'm going to make sure this agency never sends a piece of trash like this to a reputable estate ever again." The photographer hesitated, his eyes darting toward the crowd of guests, looking for someone, anyone, to signal that this had gone too far. But there was no reprieve. The guests, draped in their thousands of dollars of silk and lace, didn't look away in shame. Instead, they leaned in. Sarah looked out through a haze of tears and saw the true face of the elites. She saw women holding their gold-leafed programs over their mouths to hide snickers. She saw men in pinstriped suits raising their own smartphones, the small glowing screens creating a second, more informal gallery of her degradation. "Smile for the camera, Sarah?" Daniel sneered, leaning his face into the frame so the photographer could capture his righteous indignation alongside her broken spirit. "Show the world how you look when you're destroying a legacy. This is going to be the most famous photo of your life. It's the only time you'll ever be the center of attention in a place like this." Click, click, click. The sound of the shutter was rhythmic and relentless, like the ticking of a clock counting down the end of her life as she knew it. The flashes of light were blinding, searing the image of her stained uniform and her weeping eyes into digital memory. With every flash, Sarah felt a piece of her soul retreat deeper into the shadows. She realized then that she wasn't just being shouted at. She was being harvested for entertainment. To these people, her pain was the most interesting thing that had happened all afternoon. It was more engaging than the vows, more intoxicating than the vintage champagne. She looked toward the bride, searching for even a flicker of sisterhood, a shared moment of human recognition. But the woman in the white gown was busy adjusting her veil, her expression one of mild annoyance that the incident was taking so long. The bride wasn't bothered by the cruelty. She was bothered by the delay. To her, Sarah was nothing more than a stubborn stain on a tablecloth that refused to be blotted out. "Look at her eyes, Miller. Capture that look of, oops, I ruined a millionaire's day." A guest jeered from the front row, prompting a fresh wave of laughter that rolled over Sarah like a suffocating tide. Sarah felt her knees wanting to give way, but Daniel's grip held her upright, forcing her to endure the documented shame. She felt like a ghost in her own body. She had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, of being the shadow that provided service without presence. And now, in the span of 10 minutes, she had been stripped bare. Every flaw, every tear, every bit of her unworthiness was being broadcast to a gallery of people who viewed her humanity as a nuisance. In that moment of absolute isolation, Sarah finally looked past the cameras, past the jeering guests, and toward the far edge of the garden. Beneath the weeping willow, the man in the dark pinstripe suit had not moved. Han Seo-jin remained a silent, obsidian statue against the vibrant greenery. While everyone else was laughing or filming with their phones, he was simply measuring. He wasn't part of the laughter. He wasn't part of the documentary of her shame. He was the only person in the garden who wasn't looking at her through a lens. He was looking at Daniel Cross, and for a brief, flickering second, Sarah saw something in the way the Mafia boss stood. A stillness so profound it felt like the center of a hurricane. Daniel thought he was the director of this scene, orchestrating a public execution of Sarah's dignity for the sake of his ego. He was so caught up in the thrill of the evidence that he failed to realize the man in the sunglasses was currently drafting the final chapter of Daniel's own story. "I think we have enough, sir," the photographer whispered, his voice cracking as he finally lowered the camera, unable to meet Sarah's gaze. "Nonsense," Daniel replied, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. We're just getting to the part where she begs for her job. Miller, keep that camera rolling. I want the video of her realize exactly what happens when you cross a man like me. Sarah's world narrowed down to the sound of the grass beneath her feet and the cold, unyielding glass of the camera lens. She was alone in a crowd of monsters, and for the first time in her life, she realized that being invisible was no longer enough. To survive this, she wouldn't just need to hide. She would need to be found. And the man under the willow tree was finally stepping out of the shade. Han Seo-jin stood where the manicured lawn gave way to the deep, tangled shadows of an ancient weeping willow. To the casual observer, he was just another high-net-worth ghost in a dark pinstripe suit, a silent +1 to a wedding that clearly bored him. He was a man who understood the architecture of silence. But through the polarized lenses of his sunglasses, the garden was not a celebration of love. It was a theater of war, and he was the only one who knew the true value of the person being attacked. He had been watching Sarah Stone for 3 years. He had watched her from the tinted windows of armored SUVs, from the corners of rain-slicked streets, and through the filtered reports of his most trusted men. She was the one thing in his world that remained untouched by the filth of his trade. To everyone else in the garden, she was a maid, a mobile fixture in a black and white uniform. To Han, she was a debt of honor, a living legacy of a kindness he could never fully repay. Seeing her now, huddled on the grass with the sun glinting off the tears on her cheeks, felt like watching a masterpiece being defaced by a common street thug. His gaze shifted to Daniel Cross. Han evaluated the groom with the cold, clinical detachment of a man deciding whether to renovate or demolish a building. He saw the way Daniel's chest puffed out, the way he leaned into Sarah's personal space, and the shrill, frantic pitch of his voice. Daniel was a paper tiger, a man who mistook cruelty for authority and volume for power. He had a famous name and a pedigree that went back generations, but in Han's world, Daniel was a liability. He was a man who would break under the slightest pressure because he had never had to carry anything heavier than a silver spoon. The rhythmic click-click-click of the camera shutter began to grate on Han's nerves. It was a predatory sound, a mechanical vulture feeding on Sarah's distress. He watched the photographer zoom in, capturing the exact moment a tear fell from Sarah's chin onto the stained apron. He watched the guests, people who begged for Han's favor in the shadowed backrooms of private clubs, as they raised their phones to record the entertainment. A cold, familiar stillness settled over Han. It was the same calm that preceded a takeover, the same silence that fell before a rival's empire was dismantled piece by piece. These people believed Sarah Stone was alone. They believed she was a girl with no history and no protection, a convenient target for their bored elitism. They were so blinded by their own reflected light that they couldn't see the obsidian shadow standing just 20 paces away. Daniel Cross shouted again, a jagged insult about Sarah's kind and their place in the world. The word trash hung in the air, clashing with the sweet scent of the white roses. Han's hand went to the pinstripe of his jacket, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle. He felt the weight of the power he held, not just the money, not just the men stationed at the perimeter of the estate, but the truth. Daniel Cross thought he was the director of this play. He thought he was documenting a maid's failure to use it against her. He didn't realize that he was actually providing Han with the perfect justification for what was about to happen next. In Han's world, every action carried a price. Humiliation was a debt, and the interest on this particular debt was about to become ruinous. He watched Sarah stand her ground, her voice trembling but her spirit refusing to fully break. He saw the ghost of the woman she was meant to be, a woman of grace and quiet strength, and he felt a rare, sharp pang of pride. "Carry your dignity," he murmured to himself, repeating a mantra he knew she had been taught. The silent observer was done watching. The data had been collected. The insults had been documented. The monsters had revealed their faces. Han Seo-jin adjusted his sunglasses one last time, the dark lenses reflecting the bright, fake world of the wedding. He took a single, deliberate step out of the willow's shade and onto the emerald lawn. The movement was small, but it was the first pebble in an avalanche. As he began to walk toward the center of the garden, the air around him seemed to thicken. The guests closest to him fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats as they felt the sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. They didn't know who he was, but they knew what he represented. The arrival of a consequence they weren't prepared to face. Daniel Cross was still shouting, still pointing his finger, still basking in the glow of his own petty tyranny. He had no idea that the man in the pinstripe suit wasn't coming to join the party. He was coming to end it. For Sarah Stone, the long years of being a shadow were ending. For Daniel Cross, the nightmare was just beginning. The weight of the Vera Wang gown, once a cloud of ivory silk and delicate lace, suddenly felt like a leaden shroud around Catherine Vanderbilt's frame. She stood perfectly still, her hands clutching a bouquet of lily of the valley so tightly that the stems began to bruise under her grip. To the guests watching from the sidelines, she was the picture of bridal poise, a statue of porcelain perfection. But beneath the veil, Catherine was breathing in the sharp, metallic scent of a dying dream. She watched Daniel, the man she had just pledged her life to, and realized with a sickening jolt that she was looking at a stranger. The face contorted in rage, the veins pulsing in his neck, and the sheer, unadulterated venom dripping from his lips. This wasn't the man who had proposed to her on a yacht in Santorini. That man had been charming, sophisticated, and attentive. The man standing over Sarah Stone was a predator, a small-minded bully who used his wealth as a bludgeon. As Daniel's voice rose, echoing the same tired insults about trash and placement, Catherine's gaze drifted down to Sarah. The maid was small, curled into herself, trying to shield her dignity as best she could while Daniel's hand remained clamped on her arm. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. In Sarah's expression, Catherine didn't see anger. She saw a profound, weary disappointment. It was a look that stripped away Catherine's jewelry, her title, and her expensive dress, leaving her exposed as a witness to an atrocity. A voice in the back of Catherine's mind screamed at her to move. Step forward. Put a hand on his arm. Tell him to stop. Tell him this isn't who we are. But as she shifted her weight, she felt the eyes of her mother in the front row. A woman who valued the Vanderbilt name above all else. She saw the photographers, their lenses capturing every micro-expression. She thought of the prenuptial agreements, the merger of the Cross and Vanderbilt holdings, and the thousands of guests waiting for a celebratory toast, not a scandal. If she spoke up now, the perfect day would be over. The illusion would shatter as surely as the champagne flute on the grass. She looked at Daniel again. He was laughing now, a jagged, hollow sound, as he played to the crowd of onlookers who were recording the maid's misery on their phones. Catherine realized that this wasn't just a momentary lapse of temper. This was a reveal. This was the blueprint of her future. If Daniel could treat a defenseless woman with this much calculated cruelty because of a spilled drink, what would he do to her when the honeymoon phase ended and the real world set in? She had the power to end it. One sentence from the bride would have silenced the garden. Daniel, that's enough. It was 4 simple words. But as the silence stretched, the words died in her throat, choked by the weight of her own privilege. Catherine chose the status quo. She adjusted her veil with a trembling hand and turned her gaze toward the horizon, effectively erasing Sarah Stone from her field of vision. She chose to be a bystander, convincing herself that her silence was a form of grace, when in reality, it was the ultimate betrayal. The air in the garden grew inexplicably cold. A hush began to fall over the nearest row of guests, not because of Daniel's shouting, but because of the man approaching from the willow trees. Catherine saw him out of the corner of her eye, a dark, pinstriped silhouette that moved with a terrifying, predator-like stillness. As Han Seo-jin stepped into the light, Catherine felt a shiver of genuine fear. She had ignored the maid's suffering, but she could not ignore the presence of the man now standing at the edge of the circle. Daniel was still basking in his petty victory, unaware that his bride's silence had been his last chance at redemption. Catherine watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the Mafia boss's shadow finally fell over the groom. The choice to stay silent had been made, and now, Catherine realized with a cold dread that the consequences were no longer hers to control. The wedding was no longer a celebration. It was a crime scene, and the judge had just arrived. The sun beat down on the garden, but the air around the marble fountain felt like ice. Daniel Cross stood with his chest heaving, his expensive silk shirt damp with sweat and spite. He looked at the champagne-stained stone, then at the girl trembling before him, and a dark, crooked smile pulled at his lips. The shouting hadn't been enough. The evidence photos hadn't been enough. To feel truly like a king on his wedding day, he needed to see her completely broken. The photos are ruined because of this smudge on the marble, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory purr that carried further than his screams ever could. He pointed to the spot where the vintage champagne had pooled, mixing with the dust of the garden. And since you're the one who brought your filth into my sanctuary, you're the one who's going to fix it. Right now. Sarah looked at the spot, then back at the man who held her future in his hands. Sir, the cleaning crew is already on their way with the proper equipment. I can go fetch them. I didn't ask for the cleaning crew, Daniel interrupted, his grip tightening on his champagne flute until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. I asked for you. On your knees, Sarah. Use your apron. Use your hands. I want this stone gleaming before the next set of portraits, or I personally guarantee you'll never find a job cleaning a subway station, let alone an estate, in this tri-state area. A collective gasp rippled through the guests, but it wasn't a gasp of horror. It was the sound of a crowd leaning in for the kill. The photographer adjusted his focus, the motor of his lens whirring as he prepared to document the ultimate submission. One of Daniel's groomsmen let out a low whistle. You heard the man. Give us a show, sweetheart. It's a wedding, after all. Sarah felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the burning sting of 1,000 years of history, of women who looked like her being told to kneel for men who looked like him. She looked at her white apron, the only thing that felt clean in this den of monsters, and then at the cold, unyielding marble. To kneel was to surrender more than just a job. It was to agree with his assessment that she was less than human. Please, Daniel, the bride whispered, her voice finally breaking through her mask of silk and lace. But she didn't step forward. She didn't reach out. She stayed in her designated spot, a silent accomplice to the execution of a woman's soul. Daniel didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on Sarah, waiting for the moment her knees hit the ground. I'm waiting, Daniel sneered. Clock's ticking on your career. Down. Now. Sarah felt her legs tremble. The weight of the world, of her rent, of her survival, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She began to lower herself, her black skirt fluttering against the stone. The crowd went silent, the only sound being the rhythmic click-click-click of the camera. She could see the reflection of the sun in the spilled champagne, a distorted golden pool that looked like a mocking eye. But just as her knee was an inch from the cold stone, a shadow fell over her. It wasn't the jagged, frantic shadow of Daniel Cross. It was a broad, steady darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. That is quite enough, a voice said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The air in the garden didn't just grow cold. It became still, as if the very wind were afraid to move. Daniel spun around, his face twisted in a sneer that died halfway through the transition. Standing 5 feet away was Han Seo-jin. He had removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were as dark and fathomless as the bottom of a well. He didn't look at the groom. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at Sarah, his expression unreadable to everyone but her. "Stand up, Sarah Stone," Han said, the command quiet but absolute. Sarah froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked up and saw not a guest, but a guardian. The silence in the garden was no longer the silence of the elites enjoying a show. It was the silence of a room that had just realized there was a wolf among the sheep. Daniel blinked, his bravado flickering like a dying candle. "Excuse me? Do you know who I am? This is a private event. You're a guest of a guest." "I know exactly who you are, Daniel Cross," Han said, taking a single, deliberate step forward. The gravel didn't even crunch beneath his feet. "You are a man who thinks marble is more valuable than blood. You are a man who thinks a uniform makes a person invisible. And most importantly, you are a man who has spent the last 10 minutes making the biggest mistake of his very short, very privileged life." The breaking point had been reached. The tension that had been building since the first glass shattered had finally snapped, but it hadn't snapped in Daniel's favor. The photographer lowered his camera, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. The guests began to shrink back, sensing the predatory aura radiating from the man in the pinstripe suit. Han reached out a hand, not toward Daniel but toward Sarah. "Stand up," he repeated, his voice softening just a fraction. "The only person who will be on their knees today is the man who thought he could humiliate you." Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the expensive fabric of Han's sleeve, and as he pulled her to her feet, the hierarchy of the garden was rewritten in an instant. The maid was standing tall, and the groom was suddenly looking very, very small. The silence that followed Han Seo-jin's command was not the peaceful quiet of the garden. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a structural collapse. Daniel Cross stood frozen, his hands still hovering in the air where he had been pointing at the marble floor. His face, once flushed a vibrant, angry crimson, began to pale as he looked at the man who had dared to cross the invisible line of his private ceremony. "I don't think you heard me," Daniel sputtered, his voice cracking as he tried to summon the ghost of his earlier bravado. "This is my wedding. You're a guest of a guest at best. You have no right to interfere with my staff." Han didn't respond immediately. He continued to hold Sarah's hand with a firm, grounding pressure, ensuring she felt the solidity of his protection. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up with his free hand. Every eye in the garden, from the photographers to the Vanderbilt elders, was fixed on his fingers as they gripped the frames of his dark sunglasses. He slid them off, revealing eyes that were not just cold, but obsidian and absolute. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the end of empires and had often been the one to orchestrate them. The moment his eyes were visible, the atmosphere shifted from awkward tension to genuine, primal dread. The guests who had been snickering or filming on their phones slowly lowered their devices. There was an aura radiating from Han that transcended wealth. It was the unmistakable scent of true, lethal power. "Your staff." Han's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried to the furthest edge of the rose garden, silencing the last of the distant string quartet. "You speak of Sarah as if she is a piece of the architecture. You treat her as if her dignity is something you purchased along with the catering. She ruined the photos," Daniel shouted, though the volume felt like a desperate shield against Han's quiet intensity. "Look at the mess. Look at the—" "I am looking," Han interrupted. He took a single step closer, entering Daniel's personal space. Most people would have flinched, but Han moved with the grace of a predator that knew the prey had nowhere to run. "I see a man in an expensive suit who is so small that he must crush a woman to feel tall. I see a crowd of people who would rather document a tragedy than prevent one. And I see a groom who is currently standing on a property he thinks he owns." Daniel laughed, a high, nervous sound that died quickly in his throat. "Think I own? My family has held the deed to this estate since." Since your grandfather gambled it away in a private room in Macau, Han said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The Cross family has been living on credit and borrowed time for 3 decades. And today, Daniel, the man who holds your debt is standing right in front of you. The color drained completely from Daniel's face. He looked at the man in the pinstripe suit, really looked at him, and finally saw the shadow that had been hovering over his family's boardrooms for years. The silent observer wasn't a guest. He was the landlord. Han turned his gaze back to Sarah, his expression softening in a way that seemed impossible given the ice in his voice a moment before. You will not kneel today, Sarah Stone. Not for him. Not for anyone in this garden. He reached into his pocket and produced a clean, white silk handkerchief, placing it in Sarah's hand. Go to the car. My driver is waiting at the north gate. You are finished with this place. She isn't going anywhere. Daniel tried to interject, but a single look from Han silenced him more effectively than a physical blow. If you speak to her again, Han said, his voice dropping to a level that made the nearby photographer visibly tremble, I will ensure that the photos taken today are the last ones ever seen of the Cross family in this city. Am I making myself clear, Daniel? The groom stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open, the power of his wedding day evaporating like mist. The guests looked on in shock. The hierarchy they had spent their lives perfecting being dismantled by a man who didn't even need to raise his voice. Han Seo-jin hadn't just interrupted a tantrum. He had shifted the axis of the world. As Sarah began to walk away, her head held high for the first time that afternoon, Han remained standing in the center of the garden, a dark, unyielding shadow that the sun couldn't touch. The silence that followed Sarah's departure was thick and suffocating, like the air before a devastating landslide. Daniel Cross stood in the center of the garden, his hands trembling with a mixture of humiliated rage and a growing cold dread. He looked at the guests, the captains of industry, the socialites, the photographers, and felt the weight of their collective gaze shifting. They were no longer looking at him as the king of the day. They were looking at him as a man whose throne was visibly rotting. You think you can just come here and disrupt a Vanderbilt Cross wedding with some vague threats about debt? Daniel's voice was high-pitched, a frantic attempt to reclaim the narrative. He gestured wildly at the limestone mansion behind them. This estate has been in my family for a century. My father sits on the board of every major bank in the city. You're nothing but a suit with a loud voice. Security. Why is he still standing here? Han Seo-jin didn't look at the security guards, who were currently frozen at the edge of the garden, their radios crackling with confused orders they were too afraid to follow. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his pinstripe jacket and withdrew a slim, black leather folder. He held it with the casual indifference of a man holding a grocery list, yet the sight of it made the air in the garden grow even colder. Your father does sit on many boards, Daniel, Han said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. But he sits there as a courtesy, a relic of a time when the Cross name actually held value. What he hasn't told you, what he was too ashamed to tell anyone, is that the Cross-Vanderbilt merger wasn't a union of power. It was a bankruptcy filing disguised as a wedding. A gasp of genuine shock rippled through the crowd. Catherine Vanderbilt, the bride, stepped forward, her lace train dragging through the champagne-stained grass. Her face was a mask of porcelain horror. What are you talking about? She whispered. Han opened the folder. For the last 5 years, the Cross family business has been a hollow shell. To keep up appearances, to pay for this very estate, for the yachts, for the jewelry you gave your bride today, your father took out a series of high-interest private loans from an offshore investment firm known as Silk and Syndicate Holdings. He believed he was dealing with a faceless corporate entity. He believed he could pay it back once the Vanderbilt dowry hit the accounts. Han turned a page in the ledger, his dark eyes never leaving Daniel's. But Silk and Syndicate isn't a faceless entity. It is my firm. I am the primary investor. I am the man who has been paying your light bills, your catering staff, and your tailor for 18 months. And as of midnight last night, the grace period on those loans expired. Daniel shook his head, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. That's impossible. This estate, the deed was used as collateral 6 months ago, Han interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade through Daniel's denial. You are currently standing on my property. This fountain, those roses, the very marble you tried to force Sarah to scrub. It all belongs to me. This isn't a wedding ceremony. It's a foreclosure. The photographer, sensing the absolute destruction of a dynasty, began to snap photos with a renewed, frantic energy. These weren't the shame photos Daniel had demanded of Sarah. These were the front-page images of a family's total collapse. The guests began to murmur, the sound rising like the hum of a disturbed hive. People who had been laughing with Daniel minutes ago were now stepping away, physically distancing themselves from the stench of his sudden poverty. Han stepped closer to Daniel, leaning in until they were inches apart. The groom was now noticeably smaller, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around for an exit that didn't exist. You treated that woman like trash because you thought your money made you a god, Han whispered, a low vibration that made the nearby guests shiver. But the ledger doesn't lie, Daniel. You have no money, you have no estate, and as of this moment you have no reputation. Han looked toward his bodyguard, who was standing behind the photographer. Clear the grounds, Han commanded. The party is over. Tell the catering staff they will be paid by my firm, and they are to leave immediately. Except for the groom. He stays until the keys are handed over. The transition was violent in its efficiency. The music stopped. The elites began to scramble toward the gates, their finery suddenly looking garish and absurd in the face of Han's cold reality. Catherine Vanderbilt looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and without a word, she began to unpin her veil. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply walked away, leaving her groom standing alone amongst the ruins of his perfect day. Daniel looked down at the shattered glass on the marble. He was the one who was invisible now. He was the smudge on the background. Han Seo-jin stood over him, the dark pinstripe suit a shadow that the afternoon sun could no longer penetrate. The reveal of the ledger had done what no shout ever could. It had stripped the predator of his claws and left him naked in the garden he no longer owned. The Mafia boss adjusted his cufflinks, his work here almost done. You should have kept your voice down, Daniel, Han said, turning his back on the broken man. The silence that's coming for you now is going to be very, very long. Daniel Cross stood in the wreckage of his own ambition. The white roses, once symbols of a pure and profitable union, now looked like burial shrouds in the fading light. The distant sound of slamming car doors and screeching tires marked the final exodus of the Vanderbilt clan, a mass retreat of the wealthy and the fair weather. He was alone, save for the man in the pinstripe suit and the silence that had become a physical weight. Han Seo-jin didn't move. He stood with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching Daniel with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying insect. Then, as if a silent signal had been broadcast through the very air, the shadows at the edge of the garden began to lengthen and solidify. For men, dressed in suits as dark and sharp as Han's, stepped out from beneath the wisteria and the weeping willows. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They simply walked with a synchronized predatory grace until they formed a perfect, impenetrable circle around the groom. These weren't the estate's hired security guards. These were the iron fist of the syndicate, men whose faces were etched with the cold reality of a world Daniel had only glimpsed in whispers. Why are they doing this? Daniel's voice was a ragged whisper. He looked at the expressionless faces of the bodyguards, searching for a flicker of the deference he had commanded his entire life. He found only the abyss. I told you I'll sign whatever you want. The estate, the accounts. Just let me go. Han took a step into the circle. The bodyguards adjusted their positions instantly, a living wall of muscle and obsidian fabric. You think this is still about the ledger, Daniel? You think my time is so cheap that I would travel across an ocean just to collect on a bad debt? Han reached out, his fingers grazing the petal of a nearby rose. With a sudden, violent twist, he crushed the flower into a bruised, white pulp. In my world, money is the easiest thing to replace. It is a tool, a currency for the unimaginative. But there are other debts. Debts of blood, debts of honor, and most importantly, debts of family. Daniel blinked, his eyes darting toward the north gate where Sarah had disappeared. Family? She was a maid. She was a nobody. She worked for a temp agency. To you, perhaps, Han said, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Daniel's neck stand up. But to me, Sarah Stone is the daughter of a man who saved my life when I was a boy in a gutter in Incheon. She is a woman who chose to live a life of quiet labor rather than ask for the protection I offered her. She is the only thing in this world that I considered off-limits to the filth of my profession. The bodyguards stepped closer, the circle tightening until Daniel was forced to pull his elbows in. The air in the garden seemed to vanish. When you shouted at her, Han continued, his eyes burning with a cold, dark fire. You weren't just shouting at a girl in a uniform. You were shouting at the Silk and Syndicate. When you demanded she get on her knees, you were demanding the same of me. And when you documented her shame with your cameras, you provided me with a digital record of every reason I have to erase you from this city. Han leaned in, his face inches from Daniel's. The groom could smell the expensive tobacco and the scent of ozone that always seemed to surround the man. The cost of the estate is paid. The cost of the loans is settled. But the cost of the insult? That is a separate bill, Daniel. And that is what we are here to collect. Daniel began to shake, a fine, rhythmic tremor that made his tuxedo jacket rustle. What do you want? I want you to understand the weight of a name, Han whispered. You used yours as a shield for your cruelty. Now you will learn what it's like to have no name at all. By tomorrow morning, the Cross family will not exist in the digital or financial records of this country. No bank will hold your money. No landlord will take your signature. No friend will remember your face. You will be as invisible as you tried to make Sarah. Han nodded to the largest of the bodyguards. The man reached into his jacket and produced a thick, heavy envelope. He didn't hand it to Daniel. He dropped it into the champagne-soaked grass at the groom's feet. Inside is a bus ticket to a city you've never heard of and a new identity for a man who works in a warehouse, Han said, turning his back on Daniel for the final time. It is the only mercy you will receive. If you are still in this state by sunrise, the debt collection will move from your reputation to your pulse. The choice, as you told Sarah earlier, is yours. Han walked out of the circle, the bodyguards parting for him like the Red Sea. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The garden was silent once again, save for the sound of Daniel Cross falling to his knees, not to clean the marble, but because his legs could no longer support the weight of his own ruin. The hunter had become the ghost, and the shadow had reclaimed the sun. The black SUV waited at the north gate, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of Sarah's tired feet. As she approached, the rear door was opened by a man whose silent efficiency mirrored the atmosphere of the garden she had just escaped. Sarah hesitated for only a second before stepping inside, the climate-controlled air of the interior immediately washing away the cloying scent of roses and the heat of her own humiliation. She sat in the plush leather seat, her hands still trembling as she looked down at the stained white apron. It was more than a piece of clothing. It was the skin of the invisible girl she had tried so hard to be. With a slow, deliberate motion, Sarah reached for the ties at her waist. She unknotted the fabric and pulled the apron over her head, bundling the champagne-soaked cloth into a tight, unrecognizable ball. She left it on the floor of the vehicle, a discarded shroud of a life she would never return to. Han Seo-jin entered the car a moment later. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the silence to serve as a sanctuary. He signaled to the driver, and the heavy vehicle began to roll away from the Cross estate. Through the tinted glass, Sarah watched the limestone pillars of the gates recede into the distance. She saw the flashes of the paparazzi who had gathered at the entrance, their cameras turning away from the fleeing guests to focus on the mysterious black cars. "He thought he was documenting your shame," Han said softly, his voice a steady anchor in the quiet cabin. He didn't look at her, giving her the privacy to settle into her new reality. He spent thousands of dollars to ensure every moment of that afternoon was captured in high definition. He wanted the world to see you on your knees. A faint, bitter smile touched Sarah's lips. She thought of the photographer, Miller, and the way his hands had shaken as he zoomed in on her tears. He got what he wanted. "There are hundreds of photos." "There are," Han agreed, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were no longer the cold obsidian of the garden. They held a flicker of something resembling a guardian's pride. But he forgot one thing about cameras. They don't just capture what you tell them to. They capture the truth. And the truth of Daniel Cross is something the world is very eager to see. By the time the SUV reached the city limits, the digital world had already begun its feast. The photographer, terrified of the man in the pinstripe suit and desperate to distance himself from the sinking ship of the Cross family, had not deleted the files. Instead, the images were leaked to every major tabloid and news outlet in the country. The happy wedding photos were gone. In their place were the raw, unfiltered images of a dynasty's demise. There was Daniel, leaning forward with a face contorted in a snarl of elitist rage. There was the shot of him gripping a woman's arm with bruising force while his bride looked away in silent complicity. And most devastating of all, there were the photos of the silent observer, the man who had arrived to collect the debt that Daniel's pride had hidden. The headlines were merciless. The groom who shouted, "The ugly truth behind the Cross-Vanderbilt union. End of an empire. Private debt and public cruelty at the altar." The images Daniel had commissioned to prove his status had become the primary evidence of his moral and financial bankruptcy. The Maid he had tried to erase was now the face of a national conversation on dignity, while he had become a ghost before the sun had even set. Inside the car, Han reached into the console and handed Sarah a small, ancient-looking fountain pen and a leather-bound notebook. "My father used to say that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you carry so well that no one dares try to take it. You carried yours today, Sarah. Your father would have been proud." Sarah took the pen, her fingers steady now. She looked out at the city skyline, the lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. The uniform was gone, the invisible girl was dead, and the man who had tried to break her was currently sitting on a bus with a ticket to nowhere. She wasn't a shadow anymore. As the car sped toward a future where she would never have to kneel again, Sarah Stone realized that the most powerful thing in the garden hadn't been Han's money or Daniel's name. It had been her refusal to believe their lies. Dignity had been restored, not by the fall of a bully, but by the rising of a woman who finally knew her own worth. The cameras had finished their work, and for the first time in her life, Sarah was ready to be seen.